His name was Mark Bird, and the place he chose was in French Creek Valley, Berks County, Pennsylvania. By 1771, he had finished building his iron-making furnace and named it Hopewell. But the birth of iron-making at Hopewell was not an easy one. Through those early years, there was often too much water or not enough. Finances were seldom adequate, and there were always legal arguments over ownership of the land around the furnace. French Creek Valley offered a great many advantages to the men who wanted to make iron. There were the 4 essential natural resources: fast-flowing water, needed for turning the huge water wheel that powered the furnace bellows, ample amounts of limestone, which could be used as flux, a vast supply of hardwood trees waiting to be cut and burned into charcoal, which in turn would fuel the great furnace. And there was iron ore, which lay near the surface of the land, ore that could be smelted and molded into the many needs of a growing young nation. There was one more natural resource that Mark Bird added to the bounty of French Creek Valley: the men, the women, and even the children who were willing to do the many tasks that had to be done to keep the furnace running. He paid them good wages to live and work at Hopewell. And by the time the American Revolution had begun, the village was busy casting stoves, skillets, pots, pans, and pig iron, which were hauled to customers as far away as Philadelphia. Then the Revolution came to Pennsylvania. During the next 13 years, cannon and the shot and shells they fired came from the Hopewell Furnace and were delivered to the colonial army. Mark Bird himself proved to be a dedicated patriot who not only commanded the 2nd Battalion of Berks County Militia, but provided uniforms, tents, and provisions for 300 men at his own expense. He was a member of the Pennsylvania Assembly, chairman of the General Committee of Berks County, judge of the Berks County Court, and served in the Provincial Convention of 1776. And in February 1778, he shipped 1,000 barrels of flour down the Schuylkill River to Washington's starving army at Valley Forge. By the end of the war, Mark Bird was deeply in debt. There were countless lawsuits against him and constant pressures from his creditors. In 1788, he lost Hopewell Furnace and his other ironworks. For the next dozen years, a parade of owners tried, but failed, to make the village prosper. Then, at a sheriff's sale in 1800, the furnace and 3,000 acres of land were auctioned to Daniel Buckley, Thomas Brooke, and Matthew Brooke, Jr. Success was not immediate for the new owners. They too were plagued with bad business conditions and legal battles over the land they had purchased. The furnace was operated for a time, then, in 1808, it was shut down. Not until 1816 was the furnace fired again. The entire iron industry was expanding now, keeping pace with the new nation. And from the cast house at Hopewell came new stoves, pots and pans, farm equipment, and pig iron. Under the shrewd management of Clement Brooke, Hopewell found new markets for its products. And by 1820, the village boasted over 150 employees who converted over 5,000 cords of wood into charcoal every year to produce 1,000 tons of pig iron and 700 tons of castings. These were good years, when Hopewell blossomed into a miniature of American society. Thus, to look at Hopewell between 1820 and 1845 was to look at an important facet of America in the mid-19th century. The society that was Hopewell Village began with the Big House, which was at once a residence for the Ironmaster and his family, a hotel for visiting businessmen, employees' dining hall, the nerve center of the community, and the seat of authority for the furnace. During these prosperous years, as many as 30 people lived in the ironmaster's house, including apprentices, maids, servants, and children. Single men in the village usually ate in the basement dining room, while on the main floor, there were always visiting businessmen at the ironmaster's table, men who came to buy or sell their goods and were invited to spend the night. Through the years, the big house witnessed births and marriages and deaths. It was the scene of parties and special social occasions that brought the entire village together. Yet the many purposes of the house were but a reflection of its owner. To be an ironmaster was to be an expert in personnel, technology, production, and transportation control. He was also a salesman, an expediter, an economist, currency expert, market analyst, a credit manager, bill collector, purchasing agent, investment counselor, and bookkeeper. To perform as many tasks efficiently, the ironmaster needed an assistant who knew almost as much as he did. That assistant was the company clerk. The clerk lived in the big house, since room and board were part of his salary, but most of his waking hours were spent at the village store. The clerk was usually the furnace paymaster as well as the storekeeper, because most workers were not paid in cash. Instead, the clerk recorded each person's earnings, and the employee then drew against his pay at the store by taking goods. Prices at the company store were often lower than at neighboring stores, and nearly any product could be found on its shelves, from produce, cloth, and tools, to such imports as sugar, coffee, chocolate, and molasses. But if someone wanted a special item that was not in stock, the clerk would order it and have it brought to Hopewell on one of the many wagons that linked the village to the outside world. From the beginning, wagons rumbled in and out of Hopewell, hauling iron to customers in Reading, Wilmington, Philadelphia, and as far away as York, Pennsylvania. During the first half-century, the wagons traveled for days at a time, along public and private roads, down turnpikes, and through covered bridges. After 1825, when the Schuylkill Canal was opened, the wagons no longer traveled as far. Yet the canal opened markets to Hopewell that were as distant as New York and Boston. After 1838, when the Reading Railroad began taking business from the canal, the furnace became even more accessible to distant customers. Still, it was the wagons that united Hopewell with the canals and rivers and railways. The most essential people at Hopewell were the skilled workers, men like the founder, the molders, and the blacksmith. The founder was responsible for producing quality iron by adjusting the blast according to the load in the furnace. He also decided when the furnace was to be tapped or emptied of its slag and iron. Almost as important to the community were the molders, who poured the liquid iron into molds and practiced the exacting science of casting iron into saleable products. Ranking with the molders in skill was the blacksmith, who could forge anything from mine, farm, and furnace tools to repair any of the machinery used by the furnace or the neighboring farmers. Supporting the skilled laborers was an army of woodcutters, colliers, and miners who worked and often lived in the forest. A woodcutter was paid according to the amount of wood he cut, whether he was a full-time employee or worked only part-time to earn some extra money. The trees he cut were carefully stacked and coaled by the collier and his helpers. Sometimes 2 weeks of constant watching and tending were needed to reduce a pit of hardwood logs to the vital charcoal needed to fuel the furnace. Thus, the collier lived much of his life in crude huts, which he built near the pits he was tending. The work week was endless when the furnace was in blast. The furnace itself had to be tended day and night with men working in 12-hour shifts. Children, too, could be found at nearly every job the furnace offered, and even women were paid at the same rate as men to clean the castings when they came from the molds. The canal opened in 1825 and the Reading Railroad in 1838. In between, new iron-making methods were developed, using coal-operated furnaces that were both cheaper and more efficient than the old process. In 1853, Hopewell built its own anthracite furnace to compete with the new technology, but the experiment was unsuccessful. Industry and the railroads preferred the cheaper anthracite iron. Charcoal furnaces everywhere began to snuff out their fires. Hopewell blew out its furnace for the last time in 1883. Time and technology had finally passed the village by. And yet, from the charcoal furnaces like the one at Hopewell Village, there had been born an industry that grew into a giant. Now, experience the village for yourself. Walk its paths and roads. Enter its buildings and pause to feel the life that once flourished here.